Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. Today's class is about selecting the site and planting. If you have any questions, there's my email in the screen. Feel free to send me an email if you have questions, and we're going to make sure to get you an answer. This is a commercial food production webinar series, and this is a joint effort by myself, Patrick Byers, Kathi Kammler, and Ramon Arancibia. This is the list of classes that we have planned for this webinar series. There's 19 classes in the webinar series, and you can see we have a huge variety of topics here. We have like general knowledge topics like just like today's class about selecting a site and planting. Next week's class on Monday, crop fertility, and then we also have specialized topics like if you only need to know about blueberries, we have specific class about blueberries. Today we're gonna talk about selecting a site and planting, and the objective of this webinar series is to encourage new farmers or give new farmers the confidence and information that they need so they can take the big step on becoming a commercial grower. We want you to set you right, and we want you to begin with the right food. And if you're an established farmer, we want you to encourage to diversify, to see what else can you grow, or if you can do anything else with your produce, with your harvest. So before you choose a fruit, you have to take into consideration what's your market like. If you have people that are going to be interested in buying from you, how often will you be harvesting the fruit? How long will you have to wait to harvest the fruit? What's the pest control going to look like? Is the fruit that you want to grow difficult to grow? But most importantly, and what we're going to talk about today is, do you have the right environment to grow those crops? We're going to talk about the soil, the water, and about the water access. Before we begin, we want you to look at this chart. And this is the harvest calendar for some of the fruit crops that we're going to talk about. And just notice that some of them have really long harvest periods. The reason why is because we have different varieties that are early that come out early in the season, midway through the season, and late in the season. However, some fruit crops only have a short period of time that you're going to be harvesting them. And this is just information for you to think about labor, and when would you need it the most when you're harvesting. The other thing that we want you to think about fruit crops is that this is a long-term commitment. And this is a table. And I know this looks like a lot of data, but I just want you to focus on the second column here, how long it takes from the time that you plant the tree to harvest in years. And the reason why we're putting this is that we want you to think about it. We want to be clear with you that this is a long-term commitment. It's not something that you're going to have like the impulse to begin now, and then suddenly you're going to be like, nah, this is taking too long, I'm just going to quit. You think about the commitment and the amount of investment that you're going to put into this. We're also including in this table what's estimate life for those trees, and how much you should expect from each tree in terms of yield. You have to make sure that you're choosing the right cultivar or the right variety. Some varieties have been bred so that they're resistant, so they have innate resistance to diseases and insects. But also, some varieties are adapted to the local weather. Back in the day, you were limited to varieties that were bred in their native environments. But now, research has caught up, and they have developed varieties that are adapted to our local weather. An example of that may be with plums. American hybrid plums are adapted to most of the cold hardiness zones in the United States. And those are hybrids between European and wild American, Japanese plums and wild American plums. The other thing you have to think about is what you're going to use the crop for. And there's an example here you have with grapes. You can either have table grapes These are the ones that you eat as a fruit. And you also have wine grapes. And if you taste them, they taste really different. I personally prefer the table grapes. I tried once the wine grapes, and the taste was not great. It was very, what do you say, astringent. Yeah, I didn't like it. So they have a specific use. So you have to consider what kind of variety you're getting and what you're going to use it for, because we're talking about commercial production here. The other thing is, last year I got married, and what was it? This Monday it was our first year anniversary, and we wanted to get married in an orchard, and it's really beautiful. I mean, when they're in bloom in spring, they're really pretty. The thing is that I just finished college then, and I was broke. And as I was getting the quotes, there were places like wineries or orchards that they were charging us $5,000 just to have the space for 2 hours. And then we had to figure out how to bring the food and the drinks. So just keep that in mind. If you are really good at keeping the place pretty, and if you have the amenities and the ability to have these side income activities, this can be a really lucrative and successful enterprise. Now we're gonna move on how to select a site. And there's some things that you have to consider when you're selecting a site. And one of them is pollination. And you have to think about when the plants are in full bloom, that's when your beneficial insects are pollinating the plants. So you have to think about suspending your insecticide program at that time during bloom, or think about insecticides that are specific or that target specific pests and are not going to affect pollinators. You want to think about the climate, specifically the frost dates, temperature, air movement, precipitation, which is rain, and sunlight. And we're going to talk about those in more detail later. The soil, how well drained is the soil, what type of soil do you have, is there a slope, and the pH of the soil. And the pH is very important for blueberries and nutrition aspects. And we're going to talk about water quality and roads and neighbors. So let's begin about talking a little bit about pollination requirements. Some fruit crops require pollination. Like in this slide we have on the left side, we have some self-fertile fruit crops. And what this means is that they have self-pollination. About 90% of their pollination is self-pollination. But then within these fruit crops, you also have varieties that are the exception to the rule. Some of the varieties within these require pollination. In general, apples, pears, sweet cherries, and Japanese plums are cross-pollinated. That means that they need the help of insects to pollinate them. And a plant that doesn't get pollinated, or a flower that doesn't get pollinated, is not going to set fruit correctly. And like I mentioned earlier, you have to think about your pesticide insect control during the bloom period when you're dealing with cross-pollinated varieties. So you have to make sure that the varieties you have to make sure that you know what variety you're getting. These are just some examples of fruit that rely on insects. Those are the cross-pollinated fruits. And down there we have, at the bottom, we have fruits that rely on gravity and just wind to carry the pollen. Now, here's the first set of links that I'm going to share in the chat. So we're going to talk about climate right now. The first link is about adaptation zones. How do we know what zone we're living in and why is that important? The second link there in the slide is the historical weather data, and that's something that if you're interested in, that's useful information that you can use to make sure that you have a correct site for your food crops. So we're also going to talk about rain, and that's part of the historical weather data and the temperature. Let's begin with adaptation zones. So what are adaptation zones in hardiness? some crops do not survive cold temperatures, or the plant itself can survive the cold temperatures, but if it gets too cold when they set flower, the flowers are not going to be able to survive those cold temperatures, and you're not going to have fruit production. And the first link that I sent you is a USDA plant hardiness zone map, and you notice here that Missouri has 3 general zones, like zone 7, zone 6, and zone 5. Zone 5 has temperatures that can reach -15 to -10 degrees Fahrenheit. And there are some crops that are not able to survive these cold temperatures. Those are the minimums. So that means that you're not going to be able to plant a tree that's adapted to zone 7 in zone 5, because that tree is not going to do well. So how do you know which varieties are adapted to the hardiness zone? For example, I'm in Southeast Missouri, and the zone in my location is 7. And this is just a nursery, and this is just for demonstration purposes. The mention of individual businesses or brands is just for demonstration purposes, and that doesn't mean that we're recommending them or endorsing those brands. So this is just an example of a nursery that they have a really nice website. If you look, let's say here for apple trees, they give you a box where you can select, you can input your zip code, and it tells you what's your hardiness zone, and it's gonna put a check mark on the varieties that are adapted to that zone. So for example, in my zone, I wouldn't be able to grow Cameron Select Honeycrisp apple in this example. I'll just go with the varieties that are adapted to my zone. And then if you don't select them appropriately, you may end up losing your crop production to frost damage. And those are temperatures that are really cold that can kill the plants. And we have a couple of before and after pictures. You see the picture on the left, you see the white petals on the flowers, and you're able to distinguish them. I think this is plum trees. Yes, these are plum trees. And this is the same tree after a frost event in the night. And notice that you cannot see the white petals anymore. The flowers are all dead. So that means that you lost all the potential production that this tree has. And on the left side, we have trees or fruit crops that are really susceptible, on the top part, really susceptible to frost. And we go down to the ones that are least susceptible to frost damage as we go down through this list. So make sure that you select a tree variety that's adapted to your zone, to your hardiness zone. I talked about frost damage, and what happens is that the temperatures get so cold that the tissue inside the flower, what's going to become a fruit later on, dies. And these are the critical temperatures, and I'm going to put that link in the chat so you can have access to these. These are the critical temperatures by which you can expect a 10% die-off of the flowers and a 90% die-off from the flowers. And here's the temperature. If it gets to pair the different growth stages of the blooming period. So if you notice, as the flowers begin to develop, this temperature becomes higher. That means that the flowers are less able to survive colder temperatures as they develop. And then you end up having 10% die-off, or the 10% loss in buds, in flowers, at this when the temperatures go this low. Now, some fruit crops tolerate, you're going to still be able to have a successful fruit production. For example, apple and pears, you only need 10 to 15% bud survival to have a successful crop. And I think with cherries and peaches, you need over 50% bud survival to have a successful crop. So how to determine what was the frost damage that you have? Actually, Patrick Byers this year made a really nice video where he explains how to do this, how to assess frost damage, and I'm gonna put the link in the chat box so you can save it. It's in YouTube, and this is what I mentioned earlier, that cherries need at least 50% of buds to have a successful crops, and apple, pears, and peaches need 10 to 15% of the buds to have a successful crop. So the other thing that you have to consider when you're looking to the terrain or the place where you're going to plant your crops is that the shape of the field and the terrain is going to affect how cold it gets. So you have to look at pockets of air. If you look at the terrain from the side, like a transversal cut, if you have pockets of air, that means that remember that cool air is denser than warm air. So cool air is going to tend to accumulate at the bottom of these pockets. So that means that plants that are planted in these cold pockets are going to have higher damage from frost than the plants that are not exposed to these cold pockets of air. And here on the right, we have another diagram showing this, that cold air tends to accumulate at the lowest part of the terrain. So that means that these trees are going to be really susceptible or are going to have higher risks of suffering from frost damage. How do you prevent this? You can turn on the sprinklers if you have a sprinkling irrigation system. And I think that works up to 23 degrees Fahrenheit. If you go lower than that, that's not going to help you that much. And you have to make sure that the water covers the branches and the buds. And you can also use plastic or spun fiber covers, kind of creating a micro environment, like a micro tunnel. And that helps trap some of the heat from the sun inside the cover so that the plants are warmer during the night. Because you're afraid of frost damage, mostly night temperatures. I'm going to show you later on how to do it with site management, how you can prepare your site to prevent frost management. So I already showed you how the shape of the terrain affects that. So that'll give you an idea of where not to plant your trees. Or if you want, you can plant a little bit, a tree that's more cold hardy in the lower areas of your site. So one of the things you can do to manage frost damage is you can put like a fence around the orchard, and that will keep the cold air from coming into the orchard. But that means that you're going to have higher initial costs because you have to set up this structure and this framework. The other thing is, like I mentioned earlier, just think about cold air is denser than warm air, so it's going to flow with the slope. And if you have your orchard next to it, that cold air is going to flow through the orchard. But then if you put a barrier on the side of the orchard, you can prevent most of that cold air from entering your orchard. The other thing is air drainage. And sometimes and I've seen orchards that they're surrounded by forest or by trees. What happens is that the air is flowing down the slope, but then the cold air hits these dense vegetation, and it tends to accumulate there. If you get rid of these vegetation and you let cold air go, you're not going to have those pockets, and you're going to prevent those cold damages. And here we are in a clearing. So you see there are trees here, and before this was just a single line of trees here. And this is downslope here. And you can notice that there's like a valley here, and then there's another hill where this orchard is. So the air comes from here, and it deposits there in the valley. And this is how it looks when you look at it from down there. The cold air is just going to flow down there to the valley, and it's not going to accumulate because of the vegetation. How do you know when you should be prepared for this? You have to look at the last spring frost date. And in Missouri, depending on where you live, it's going to change. I'm in Southeast Missouri, and in Butler County, And the last frost date is between April 5 and April 10 in this area. So during these dates, I should be more aware of the weather report and keep an eye on it and be ready in case we have frost damage and be ready to act on it. The other thing you can do to prepare for frost is some people start small fires or put burners, but that's not cost effective because you're going to burn fuel and you're adding to your costs. Now, just look at this map, and this, when I got this, it was updated till 2000. And you know that weather data is based on averages and historical data. So these are approximates. Don't take these like, oh, these are the days that I need to be aware of it. So just give it a leeway. I'll give it like 5 to 10 days, more or less, to these ranges. One website that I like to look myself is Farmer's Almanac. Has a frost date, and you put your zip code there, and it gives you what's the last spring frost date. But notice that there's a disclaimer at the bottom that says that there's a 30% chance that that's going to happen. So because this is based on averages, and it's hard to predict what's going to happen next with the weather. Looking at historical weather data, how do you know if you're going to have enough rain or if you're going to need supplemental irrigation? I like to look at this weather data. Let's see. Yeah, I already shared this link with you earlier. So you see here you have the word normals instead of averages. A normal is just a calculation based on 30 years of data. That's what normals mean. That's why it doesn't have the word average there. So in my area, here's it gives me this graph where it shows me what's the maximum temperature, the average temperature, and the minimum temperature for each month. And it also gives me how much rain or how much precipitation do we have. Now, since we have the precipitation down here, it's hard to see how many inches of water we're getting there. But it also gives you a table that tells you for January you had this much precipitation. So if you notice where I live in, May, June, July are really wet months, and just think about some trees require between 1 and 2 inches of water per week. So if we have 4 weeks, that means that I need between 4 and 8 inches, or sorry, 4 and 6 inches of water. I'm gonna need some supplemental irrigation for some of these months. So that's how I use this weather data. I like to use it like just to think about how much water I'm gonna need. Do I need irrigation for these months? And these are the months that you're gonna have harvest, or some of the fruits are going in the late varieties. Some of the fruits are gonna start to set in these dates. The other thing that you have to think about is chilling hours. And this is interesting because I live in Honduras. Well, I am from Honduras originally, and you don't see peach trees or apple orchards over there. And I've seen many people attempt and try to grow the trees, and the trees look always sick and they never set fruit or flowers at all. And that's because some trees need a specific amount of hours in between this temperature range, between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And we don't get that down there in Honduras. So this is like the trigger or the signal that tells the tree, after you've been so much hours in these temperatures, you're ready to set blooms or flowers and fruits. And here's a list of chilling hours for some fruit crops, and you see there's a range, and that's because it changes by varieties. Some varieties might need 800, some varieties might need more cold hours at this temperature. And how do I know how many chill hours I get in my location? I'm gonna drop another link in the chat. And this is a tool where you can just look at a map of what was the chilling hours that you got last year or the last season. And you can also get an average from 1987, 86 in this case, till 2016. Now you're gonna notice that the averages are gonna be lower because eventually you're gonna have warmer years and colder years. So I like to look at the last year, how it looked like. And if we go closer in to Missouri, you see that last year we had over 1,400 hours of chill. And that means that in this, for this year, the crops that need chill hours are gonna have a great set of flowers, or they're gonna have they did have that signal, that trigger from the environment to set flowers. Now, what happens if you have a year that you get less than what you need? That means that those trees are not gonna, there's a risk or there's a chance that those trees are not gonna set enough or a lot of flowers. So that's why sometimes you say with some crops, oh, this is a good year. Like some crops, they say you have a good year followed by a bad year. And sometimes that's because you didn't have enough chilling hours, but it's variable. So you have to keep an eye on the weather. So we talked about frost and weather and climate data and how these can affect your crop and the site that you're gonna put your crop in. The other thing that we talked about was the terrain. And this also has to do with air movement. Eventually you want air to move through the field because you want to avoid these pockets of air that are not moving, because you also have higher disease incidence in these pockets of air that air gets trapped in. So you want to make sure that you design the terrain so that you don't have these pockets of air. Moving on to the soil, you need at least 3 feet deep. You want to have a soil that's well drained, slightly acidic, and we're going to talk about what does that mean. And organic matter is important for many of these fruit crops. So let's talk about soil pH. We know that pH 7 is neutral. So like most crops prefer to be in a pH between 6 and 7. Why is that? So we have this chart here, or this picture, and what this picture is showing how available the nutrients are at a specific pH. It doesn't tell how much nutrients, how much of the nutrient is in the soil. Let's assume that you have the adequate amounts of nutrient in the soil. So the thinner the bar for each nutrient is, that means that something in that soil is preventing that nutrient from being available to the plants. So what happens, let's say if you go to a pH 4.5, if you go to a pH 4.5, for example, nitrogen, something in the soil at that pH is binding that nitrogen. You have the right amount of nitrogen in the soil, but this nitrogen is not going to be available for the plants to uptake. So what's recommended for field crops in soil is to have a pH between 6 and 7. The exception to the rule is blueberries. Blueberries like acidic soils. Blueberries like it when the soil is between 4.5 and 5, and really acidic. So what happens if you did a soil test and you notice that your pH is out of the recommended range? So I'm just going to talk briefly about adjusting soil pH because we're going to cover that next class. But to lower the pH, to make it more acidic, let's say you have a pH of 8 or 7.5, you want to apply elemental sulfur, use sulfate type fertilizers, use fertilizers that have urea and ammonium-based fertilizers. And I'm going to talk about this later, what that means and how that works. And there are some organic amendments like incorporating peat moss into the soil and some specific plant residues like pine needles. To increase, I apologize, it should say here to increase the pH on here, and it didn't come up. But to increase the pH, let's say you have a pH that's too acidic and you want to bring it up. You have a pH that's, let's say, 4, and you want to bring it up to 6. You're going to use limestone, and we have different types of limestones. calcitic, dolomitic. Calcitic is just calcium. Dolomitic has calcium and magnesium in it. And then the purity and the particle size is going to tell you how quickly this limestone is going to change the pH. The coarser the limestone, the longer it's going to take that pH to change. You can use potassium bicarbonate if you want to do something that's water soluble. Flowable lime. There's hydrated or burned lime, and I have some asterisks here. These, if you put it on the soil when you have the plants on, these are going to kill the plants. They're going to burn the plants. So these are recommended for pre-plant applications before you put anything, before you plant anything on the soil. And then you can use nitrate-based fertilizers. Also, something that people don't talk about is when you have your water, if you have a water with high alkalinity, and what that means is that it has a lot of bicarbonates dissolved in it, this water is going to increase the pH of the soil over time. And that's problematic when you have blueberries, because if you have water with high alkalinity or hard water, that's going to increase the pH over time, and you don't want that with blueberries. How to lower the pH of the soil? You use elemental sulfur, and these are just recommendations on how much sulfur to add how many pounds of sulfur per acre to add to lower, let's say, for example, here from 8.5 to 6.5. And notice that the amounts are different based on the texture of your soil. Oh, sorry, I was just looking at something in the chat. Right. So, did you get the links in the chat? I'm just doing a check. Just write yes in the chat if you got the links in the chat. And I'm going to keep going on with the presentation. So, notice that the amounts of sulfur that you need are going to change based on the soil texture. On the right side, we have a small table because okay, you don't see the links. I see. I know what happened. I apologize. I was sending the links just to one attendee. I'm gonna click them and put them again. I apologize for that. All right, I just did that. Okay, so on the right side, we have how many pounds of sulfur you need to lower the pH to 4.5, and this is specifically for blueberries. And notice again that the amounts are going to change depending on the soil texture that you have. So it's important that you know what kind of soil you have there. Now, how do you know how much limestone to add in order to increase the pH, to go the other way, to make it more basic? So soil tests, when you send the soil sample to the soils lab, they're gonna tell you how many pounds of limestone to add, or some laboratories will tell you an effective neutralizing material, ENM number. And this is just how much amount of limestone you need to get a change in pH. And the way you use it is like to determine how much limestone you need per acre in tons, you divide the ENM that comes in the soil test by the ENM of the liming material. And let's do an example, right? So let's say your soil test comes back from campus and it tells you that you need a 1200 ENM for your field. So you go to your limestone dealer and they have a limestone that has 400 ENM. So how many tons of you're gonna need of that limestone to neutralize these 1200? You just divide 1200 divided by 4. And that's gonna give you how many tons you're gonna need of limestone per acre. So it's important that you get your soil tested to make sure that you know that the pH of the soil is correct. Now, we talked about that. The other thing that I like to use to make sure that the site that I'm looking at is gonna be adequate for what you intend to grow, and I'm putting the link in the chat right now, is I use this tool that the University of Missouri has, and this is a wonderful tool. I used this tool when I was applying for this job, and I was like, oh, great, they have this tool, and I was just is so excited about this. So it's this map room. It's called All Things Missouri. The link is in the chat box. And if you put here in like a keyword, if you let's say put, if you type in apples and you click search, it's gonna give you these options. You can click on select apple suitability, and it's gonna show you a map of Missouri. And it's gonna tell you if the location where you're at is suitable. Let's say, in this case, it's for blackberry. When I took this screenshot, I was looking at blackberries and the soil pH. So you see there are some areas in Missouri where you cannot grow blackberry because the pH is not adequate. However, this tool only tells you, this search term only tells you if it's suitable or not. And you don't know why is it suitable? Is it because the pH is too high, or is it because the pH is too low? The other search term that I like to look at when you click search, I put the farm class by unit, and notice that there's a year there. We have some historical data. There's some data for 2008, I think, and 2012, and I like to use the latest one. And let's say farm class, and if I click on the area that I'm interested in, this box is gonna pop up, and it's gonna tell me what kind of soil we have there, and it tells me what the farmland class is, and it says this is this is gonna be good farmland if it's drained. But what if I want to know more about this soil? What's going on with this soil? So what I do is I click this the soil type. And when I click here, it's gonna give me a full report and pages and pages long, and it's gonna talk about the soil itself. If you feel overwhelmed by this amount of information, that's why you have extension specialists. That's why we're here. We're here to help you understand what's going on here. So if you have questions about this, and if you're interested about this, you can just come to our offices and we can go with you and walk you through these tools and trying to help you understand what these numbers mean. What I like it is, if you keep scrolling down, it's gonna give you what the soil is, what the percentage of clay, sand, and what the percentage of organic matter is for this soil. Now, keep in mind that these are data, these represent data that was taken in the past. It doesn't mean that that's the current state of the soil. So just keep that in mind, because it's important for you to do an in-person inspection about this. So if you're interested in the All Things Missouri map room, these are the map room search terms that I like to use. I like to type in the specific crop name. I like to use the farm class, and I like to get the latest year information. And then you click on the map, and then click on the soil type to get a report of the soil. And these are just examples of things that I like to look at in case you're interested in that. However, like I mentioned earlier, these digital data or tools are just as good as the data they rely on. So just keep in mind that for some areas, the data may be old, or the data may not be available for some areas. And I have encountered that. So you have to go in person, and you have to go to check the terrain. And like we talked earlier, you want to look at slopes and pockets where cold air may settle, and just to have an idea of where not to plant some specific trees or what to do in order to prevent frost damage. Look at the soil, and if you see water flow marks, that's an indication of erosion, and you don't want that. You want to, if you see that, you're going to start to think about, that means that I need to implement soil conservation practices. How much, if you have access to water, how easy is it to get into this farmland, and what existing infrastructure is there? Do you need to buy, I don't know, a packing, or build a packing room, or does the place already come with a packing room? Make sure to interview the owner if you're purchasing the land, and take all the information that you can in order to get an idea in your head of how much more you're going to have to invest in this land in order to make it suitable for what you want to plant. And if the owner doesn't have one, just take a soil sample. I mean, it's just like $12 or $15, and you're going to save a lot of money if you know what you're doing. So You want to have a site that's close to a water source. And like I mentioned earlier, fruit plants need between 1.5 and 2 inches of water per week. Preferably, you want to have drip or micro irrigation sprinkler. If they don't have it installed, you might want to think in investing in one of those. If the area where you're living it's really dry or it has months where you're going to need the irrigation system, or if you're going to do if you're going to apply the fertilizer through the irrigation system. And just think about mulches. Sometimes you might have to bring in material, and it's nice to have mulches because these tend to hold water and prevent evaporation. So that means that you're not going to have to water frequently. In terms of water quality, these are the things you have to look at. It's important if your intention is to grow blueberries, you want to look at alkalinity. And I'm going to talk about what alkalinity means, but that's what I mentioned earlier, hard water, because that water over time is going to increase the pH of the soil, and you don't want that with blueberries. So before you purchase that site, make sure that the watering is not hard if you're going to grow blueberries. Dissolved salts is just the salinity of the water, and you don't want high salinity because that means that some crops are really susceptible to high salinity levels. So this is just an example of water test report, and you see it gives you whatever you're testing for on the left side, and then it gives you what the acceptable range for this, or what you want those numbers to be in. But let's look at alkalinity. So alkalinity is reported like three ways. You can report it as bicarbonate, HCO3, or you can report it as calcium carbonate, right? Both are, the only difference is the test that they make. One of them looks for HCO3 and the other one looks for calcium carbonate. But the interpretation is what you need to look at. If you're over 160, that means that your water over time is going to tend to increase the pH of the soil. You want to have it between this range in terms of alkalinity. And then the other thing you want to look is at soluble salts. You want something that's below 1. Some crops are really sensitive to high salinity, so some crops might want something lower than that. All right. So I've talked about alkalinity. So what is alkalinity? And I like to refer to as water with high alkalinity as hard water, or think about it like water that has kind of like dissolved limestone in it. So what contributes to high alkalinity? Sometimes you're going to have bicarbonate, carbonates, and some ions dissolved in your water. And I don't know if you've seen this, but I've seen some pipes or some faucets that you see a white crust building up around it. And that's just a sign that that water has high alkalinity, and that's hard water. But the only way to tell us is if you take a water test. And like I mentioned before, think of it as dissolved limestone. So if you have high alkalinity, the higher it goes, that means that the more dissolved, in quotation marks, limestone it has. And the problem with this is that if you're growing crops with this water, the pH of the water is going to increase over time. Sorry, of the soil. So how do you correct for alkalinity? There's two ways you can correct for this issue. One is using fertilizers that have high ammonium nitrogen content. And I think I'm going to talk about it in the other class, in the following class. I don't know if I included these slides in this presentation, but in next week's class, I have something about understanding the fertilizer label and what to look at when looking at these. Fertilizers that are based on ammonium nitrogen, they don't have calcium oftentimes, and the bacteria in the soil use this nitrogen, and when they use the nitrogen, this acidifies the lowers the pH, and that neutralizes the alkalinity. Or you can inject an acid into the water. And we're going to talk about acids that you can use. and we have a list of acids, and this list, for example, here it's organized like what is the cheapest. Citric acid is the cheapest, and you go up to sulfuric acid, which is the most expensive. Safe in terms of how careful you should be with these ones. Citric acid is the safest one, and then the most the ones that are not really safe, that you have to make sure that you have protective equipment when handling them, are sulfuric and nitric acid. You can use ferrous sulfate, but the problem with this is that you cannot dissolve these in water, and they can clog irrigation system. Or sulfur, that's to the soil, not to the water. You cannot add this to the water. Right. So this is just an example of that I like to put in my slides and try to make people understand what alkalinity means. So we have grower A and grower B. We have grower A has a pH of 9.3 and grower B has a pH of 8.3. Grower A has lower alkalinity but has higher pH. Grower B has lower pH but has higher alkalinity. Which one of these two growers is going to need more acid to get to the pH of 5.8? All right, let's look at it. Grower A is just going to need 15.8 ounces of sulfuric acid, while grower B is going to need 68.6 ounces. So even though the pH here is lower, it doesn't have to do anything. The actual reading, the actual pH doesn't have to do anything with how much acid you're going to need to lower the pH. The alkalinity is. So if you notice, the higher the alkalinity, the more acid you'll need to neutralize that pH to 5.8. And this is just a graphic example of this. Like here, you're adding the different ounces of sulfuric acid on the horizontal axis, and here's the pH change on the y-axis. So if you just added this much acid here, you start to see a quick drop in the pH with this grower that has the lower alkalinity. And the grower that had the higher alkalinity, he needed more acid to lower the pH. So alkalinity is something that you cannot measure with a pH. You have to measure it through a kit, or you have to send it to a lab. So how do you know how much acid to add? That's a question that I get asked most of the time. And I like to use this online calculator. And it requires you to have information from the water test. And you're gonna, if you click in there, you're gonna be greeted by this screen where you have to put what's the pH of your sample, what's the alkalinity of your sample, and just make sure to select here what the lab report shows you. In this case, the lab showed me alkalinity as parts per million of calcium carbonate. What I want this alkalinity to be, I want it to be 50. And then if I click submit the sample, it's gonna give me a report. I know this looks overwhelming, but it gives you, it's nice because it gives you a lot of information. It gives you, if you're gonna make small quantities, how much milliliters or how many ounces you need per gallon of water of each acid. And it's gonna tell you how much to add for each one of them. So this is a really nice tool. Or if you're using an injector, how much you need if you wanna set that injector in line. And this is a nice tool to know how much alkalinity to add. How to add it, there are automatic injectors, and these injectors have the capability to connect a pH meter in line with the piping. You see here, there's the piping, and here's where the pH meter gets inserted into the piping. So they measure the pH, and they can measure that change in pH. All right. So this is a summary for site selection. Check the climate data. Make sure that the variety you're purchasing, you're getting, is adapted to the zone where you want to plant it. Check for the chilling hours. Check for the precipitation, and check for frost dates. Make sure that the land that you're going to use it for is suitable. Use the tool. Use the map tool that I show you, and go make an in-person inspection. And if you need us, just schedule an appointment with us and we can come with you and check the site. That's why we're here. We're extension. And in person, just make sure that the land has access to water, roads, what's the water quality, what's the terrain, and if there's any existing infrastructures that you can use for your production. Now, let's move into planting. So before you begin, and we already talked about this, make sure that you do your research, make your effort into making sure that the site you're buying or you're gonna plant your plants in is adequate. Then you're gonna set the planting plans, and I'm gonna give you, we're gonna talk about what are the best dates to plant or the best times of the year to plant your trees and the layout. And we already talked about pollination rates, winter hardiness, and this is very specific for variety, the susceptibility to pests and diseases. So there you have to talk with your supplier and tell them, I need something that's resistant to a specific disease that you or other growers in the area have issues with. So plant in spring and the fall, and usually you want to buy rootstock, and this is what you get. You can get like a container grown plant. You can get a bare rootstock, or you can just get a piece of root or stolen for some crops, and this is going to grow into a plant. Some of them, that's how it comes. Like, we're going to talk about how to handle properly your planting material, how to plant it properly, and how to take care of the young plants. All right, so there are several options for planting. You can plant, some people like to plant the seeds from their own orchard and start a nursery and seedling and get the seedlings themselves. You can plant container grown plants, the ones that you find in Home Depot or Walmart, or you can buy bare roots. That's the one that you get from commercial nurseries. When to plant? The seeds, you want to plant them in the spring, and then the transplant is going to happen late in the fall or early spring when you're doing containers or bare rootstock for most of the tree-based crops, fruit crops. Now with the seeds, the thing is that you're gonna get random genetics. You don't know what variety is gonna be because some of them are cross-pollinated, and it's gonna be different. And when you're buying a container or a bare rootstock, you know what you're getting. You know what variety, and that's good if you want uniformity in terms of when you're gonna harvest and the quality of your harvest. Now these are expensive. If you go with container crops, just think about the plastic and all the time it took and care it took to keep these containers and make sure that these containers are ready for you to plant. Bare rootstocks are a little bit cheaper than container crops. You have to keep an eye on the root mass, and we're going to talk about these later on. The problem with containers is that the roots tend to twist around the containers, and that's not good when you're planting trees. We're going to talk about how to take care of that and how to look at that. Shelf life, you can extend the seedlings. You can just plant them in pots and keep them there. When you get that planting material, it's easier to keep a container planting material alive and in storage before transplant. Bare rootstocks, they don't have any soil, so the roots are exposed to drying. So once shipped, you have to make sure that you are preventing those roots from dehydrating or from being damaged, and you transplant them immediately. Availability, that depends. If you're doing seeds yourself, that depends on you. But if you're doing containers, you can just walk into Walmart or Home Depot or these big stores, and you're going to be able to find those available. Now, bare rootstocks, they're hard. Sometimes you have to place pre-orders in advance in order for them to arrive in time. So planting, when you're about to plant the whatever planting material you get, you want to make sure that the day is overcast. You don't want a sunny day because you want to make sure that that plant doesn't suffer a lot of stress. The planting process is stressful in itself for the plant. So you want to make sure that it's not a hot sunny day when you're doing it. So you want a weather that's overcast. The other thing is that you want to plant the trees or most of the fruit crops when they are dormant, and that means that when they don't have any leaves, when they're in the middle of the winter, not in the middle of the winter, but when they know they had to be dormant. You want to inspect the roots and make sure that you prune the dead roots. You get rid of the twisted roots or diseased roots. You want to plant in raised beds. You don't want this situation in the picture here, because what will happen is that water, when it rains, water is going to accumulate these, and when you have soaked or waterlogged roots, that's an ideal environment for pathogens and diseases to thrive. So you don't want this kind of scenario here. You want to make sure that you plant it in raised beds or mounds. And right after planting, just make sure to give the tree enough water. Let's begin with bare rootstocks. When you're transplanting bare rootstocks, you want to make sure that when those rootstocks arrive to your property, make sure that you're protecting them from the sun and they're not drying. Usually you can wrap them with moist burlap or wrap them in burlap, and over time just water them so that they keep moist. You want to lay the transplants flat on their side, because you don't want to lay them standing up, because that's going to damage the roots, and you don't want that. You want healthy roots to make sure that the tree is going to be successful. Now dig a hole that's no deeper than the root ball, but twice as wide, because you're gonna, when you put that rootstock on the ground, you want to make sure that you spread the roots in the hole and do not combine soil. After you plant the bare rootstock, it's a good idea to add mulch and water the plant. And like I mentioned earlier, mulch is important because that prevents water from evaporating too quickly. Now, container crops, they're a different story. Usually what happens is that the plastic pot or the container that these plants are growing are going to constrain the root growth. And you're going to start to see the roots circling around, and this is not good. Why this is not good? Now, you look at this picture in the middle. This is a tree that was from a container, and you have this root that's circling around the tree trunk. Now, this root is going to stay there. And as the tree grows, this root is going to start to strangle the tree, and that's not good. It's going to weaken up the tree on this side, and it's going to strangle the tree. And when there's a wind, what will happen is this is the weakest part of the tree, and that's where the tree is going to snap and break, and you don't want that. So how do you deal with this? So the first thing is that you have to make sure that when you get the container crop, you wash off most of the soil or the potting mix from the rootstock, and then you're going to see these. You're going to have the fine mass of roots, and you want to make sure that you straighten all the twisted roots however possible, and the roots that you cannot straighten up, you want to make sure that you prune them, that you cut them. It's okay. The tree is not going to you're not going to kill the tree if you prune the roots, if you do it properly. Just make sure that your pruning tool is clean. And one way to sanitize pruning tools in between plants is to dip them in 70% alcohol, or there's also a iodine solution for that. Do not use bleach, because bleach is going to rust the metal in your pruning tools, and sometimes bleach is going to be harmful because you're making a wound here. So once you straighten the roots and prune the twisted roots, you can go ahead and plant container transplants. Like I mentioned before, you want to make sure that you apply water into these trees. And a rule of thumb that I've seen in many extension websites is that you want to apply between 1 and 1.5 gallons per inch of stem diameter. So you go 6 inches high, and then you measure how wide the stem is. So if it's 3 inches, that means that you're going to apply 3 gallons of between 3 and 4.5 gallons of water. Right. Now, if you don't have an irrigation system set up, right after you plant it, you can use these bags. And I forgot the name of these bags. I looked it up before the presentation and I just forgot about them. But you fill these bags with water and they're gonna start to leach the water slowly to the root zone there. Right. Now, when you water newly established trees, you don't want to water close to the trunk. You want to follow the shape of the tree. You want to follow what's the edge of the tree, and you want to make sure that the water is around the tree. You don't want this because this promotes water lodging, and this is not good for newly established trees. Remember, the tree is stressed, and if you add another stress like a lot of water, the tree is going to have to deal with those stresses, and it's not going to have enough energy to defend itself against diseases. You know what I mean? So you want to make sure that the tree is set up right so that it can survive this stressful operation, but also at the same time be able to fend off against any potential diseases. Now, after you plant a tree, you may have some issues. I mean, the job is not done when you do that. And I've seen this picture many times, and this is what happens sometimes, that wildlife will come and they're gonna start doing this to the trees. So once you plant the trees, you have to make sure that you're protecting these trees against wildlife, like mice sometimes can chew on the barks of trees, or this can happen where deer come and they start to play around with the trees. I think they sharpen or they get rid of their horns on the tree trunks. Now, moving on to planting layouts. Usually you want to arrange them in a grid, and you want to set up your rows so they're going from north to south. The reason why is, for example, in northern latitudes, like where we are, when we have 4 seasons in the year, during the winter, you have limited amount of sun, right? So you want to maximize sunlight exposure. That's why you orient them north to south. The rows going from north to south. Like I mentioned earlier, sometimes it takes some time for these crops to become commercially viable because it takes between 4 and 6 years on average for them to start bearing fruits. So one option is doing intercropping. And what this means is that in between the rows of your fruit trees, you can have a crop, a vegetable crop or a cash crop alongside the fruit crop, so that you have a source of income during those years that those trees are not productive, while you wait for them to be productive. And this is something that's called a double alley cropping system. And this was developed for nut orchards. And you see here is that you put the trees 40 feet in between, and the rows where you have in between the trees are 23 feet. But then you leave a space of 57 feet. And here's where you're gonna have the intercrop here. And someone may ask me, why don't you grow a crop here in this alley here? Well, just keep in mind that you still want access to work on these trees. So that's the function of this thing. Because if you fill this whole free area without trees, with crops, you're not gonna have access to work on these trees later on. So this is just like future proofing in case in the summer you have to do some work on the trees. And this is just a picture of the double alley row cropping system. And this is a combined, I think they're harvesting rice here. I'm not sure, it looks like something like that. Or I don't know what kind of crop is that. Right, so that's an option. You can do the grid arrangement, but you can also start thinking about intercropping if you don't want to wait for the crop to become viable, sorry. Now, moving on to apples, I'm just gonna start to quickly talk about each specific crop. I don't wanna go deep into each specific crop because if you saw, we have a specific class for each crop. So I'm just gonna briefly go over these, but I'm gonna focus on the planting material for these. So apples, you plant them in spring to late March when they're dormant before bud break. Or you do it in the fall in mid to late October. And you do it when the ground is not frozen. Obviously, you want to make sure that you're able to dig the holes on the ground. Typical yields, what you want to expect per tree, if you're using a dwarf and semi-dwarf varieties, 3 to 6 bushels, 6 to 10 bushels. Sorry, and I'm going to talk about what these dwarf and semi-dwarf means for those who are not familiar with these terms. So usually plants have a specific height that they will go up to, right? So dwarf trees are the ones that they don't go over a specific height. They're really small, and they're really nice because it's easier in the long term to harvest and work on these. So you want to have dwarf trees because in the future you want to be able to lower your operation costs with these. And you plant these between 6 to 8 feet apart when you're having dwarf trees. Semi-dwarf trees, they're larger, they grow more, taller and wider. So the spacing here is larger on semi-dwarf. And if you're doing a full-size apple tree, you're going to space in more, but just keep in mind also that these are going to be hard to work on later on, and your labor costs are going to be higher with these. And if you have to implement a spray program, let's say, for example, which one of these trees are going to take more pesticides or more chemicals to get treated. So just think about these things. I'm not going to go over this. You have that in the handout, but these are just a list of apple trees that require pollination, and they're early, mid-season, and late. Some of them are disease resistant. There are some exceptions. You have the handout. You can look at them. If for some reason you didn't get the handout, just send us an email and we're going to send you the handout. It's important for us that you get this information. And this is just a picture that shows different apple varieties, how they look. Pears, these are the cultivars. You have European pears and you have Asian pears. I'm not going to go deep into these. I think Michelle Warman is going to briefly touch on pears when she talks about apples. Peaches, you got a lot of variety here. You have with stone fruits. All right, so sorry about this, I got distracted. So stone fruits are the fruits that have that hard seed inside. Let's say, for example, cherries, peaches, plums, apricots. They have these hard, really hard seed inside them, and that's why they're called stone fruits. So these are just some of the different kind of stone fruits that you can get: peaches, cherries, and plums. And you want to plant them between 24 feet apart in between rows and 18 feet apart between trees. That's the planting distance on average for most of these. But make sure that you do your research, because some varieties have specific requirements. Some of them have like really short growth habits. So you want to make sure that you contact your supplier, your nursery supplier, and make sure that you get the accurate requirements in terms of spacing. Now, there's multiple varieties for peaches. Now, the nice thing about about stone fruits is that they're within the same family. And recently, breeders they started to have fun with them. So they started to interbreed, like say, peaches with apricots, and we got these modern hybrids of peaches. I haven't tried them. I see them in the supermarket and I'm like, oh, I wish I can try them. But then I see the price and it's like, oh, $5 per pound. It's too expensive. But just look at these modern hybrids. Like they have a huge markup. I mean, they're selling for a lot of money. So I think this is a nice opportunity for you. Maybe you want to tap into that market, or maybe you want to start growing these, and that'll give you time to build the market, like advertise it and make sure that to get people excited about them. I'm excited about them. I haven't tried them because they're too expensive. And eventually I hope that someday I don't know, I'll be able to afford them and try them. Strawberries, Ramon is going to talk about that, about strawberries in the future. He's more of an expert in strawberries than I am, but I'm just going to briefly touch about how to plant them. But before we move on, I want to make sure that you understand what the basic anatomy of the strawberry plants. And there's some concepts that you need to understand when you're growing strawberries. It's not called a stem, it's called a crown. And that's where most of the leaves and shoots comes from. And then you have a runner, and the botanical term for this is a stolon, and this is how you propagate strawberries. You cut the daughter plant, and that's what you propagate when you want to plant strawberries. Now, planting depth is really important, the way you plant strawberries. You don't want to have exposed roots when you plant strawberries, but you don't want to drown the crown under the soil, because that's going to be a plant that's going to be more susceptible to diseases. And if it rains a lot, the crown is going to rot, and you don't want that. You want to make sure that you plant them right at the baseline where the crown meets the roots. Now, you want to plant them 42 inches in between rows and 18 inches in between plants. That's a general rule of thumb for strawberries. Keep in mind that there are different varieties of strawberries, and depending on what your objective is, you grow these strawberries. June-bearing strawberries are the ones that you plant a year before, and then you they need the cold temperature. You remember the chilling hours. Some varieties need 800 hours. And then the cool temperature is going to send the trigger to the plant to produce blooms, to produce flowers. And they're the ones that you're harvesting now, early in the summer, late in the spring. Those are June-bearing strawberries. You have the day-neutral strawberries, that those, regardless of the length of the day, they're going to be producing strawberries. And you also have the air-bearing strawberries that they produce throughout the year. And I think this is the one that they like to use inside greenhouses when you grow them hydroponically. And you also have ornamental strawberries that they're mostly grown for the pretty flowers. I'm not going to go more into detail about the cultivars. Ramon is going to do a better job than I'm going to do talking about strawberries to you right now. So just stay tuned. We're going to tease this topic later. Brambles. So a bramble is anything that's a raspberry or a blackberry. That's what the name brambles enclose, those two types of fruit crops. So just keep in mind that there's some terminology that you have to become familiar if you're going to grow brambles. Now the roots and the crowns are perennial. That means that when you plant them, they're going to come back every year. And what happens is, from the crowns, you're going to have these canes coming up. So if it's a first-year cane, if it's a young cane that's under a year old, it's going to be called primal cane. And typically, depending on the varieties, these canes are not going to produce any fruit. There are some exceptions. There are some varieties, but primal canes are not going to produce fruit. Now, when this primal cane survives a winter, and the following year, the second year, it becomes a floricane. So the winter is going to tell this primal cane, oh, you already got the cold, you have to put flowers out. When they start putting flowers out, it's called a floricane. That's when they bear fruit. And then after they bear fruit, the second year, they die. So each cane has a lifespan of 2 years, right? And this is what's here in this text here. And you can read more about it, more in detail in the handout. So when you're gonna plant brambles, either raspberries or blackberries, make sure that you get tissue culture, not nursery stock. Don't get the, what's it called? You see here in this picture, it propagates the crowns. They have runners and suckers. Try not to get that, because you don't know what kind of diseases with these plants were exposed. So if you get tissue culture nursery stock, at least you know that these plants are free and clean of any diseases. And you don't want to bring these diseases into your property if you're going to plant these. Typically, you want to plant them, the rows have to be between 10 and 12 feet apart. And then in between plants, it's going to vary. It's going to vary depending on what kind of brambles that you get. And these are just different names that tell you how the growth of the berries are. Usually semi-erect blackberries, they're hard. They don't, it's hard for them to stand on their own feet, so you need to have a trellis system for them compared to the erect blackberries. This is taken from the table that I showed at the beginning. What are the expected yields? So if everything goes well with blackberries, this is what you expect. And the reason why this is given in terms of pints and not pounds is because that's how you market them. That's how they're going to buy them from you. I'm not going to go into a lot of details here because we have a class specifically for raspberries and blackberries. But just keep in mind that we have a primocane raspberry. And remember what I said earlier, that primocanes typically don't put a fruit. These kind of varieties are the exception. These are primocanes that are going to put fruit. Let's say you planted these in spring. The primocane came up, and late in the fall, they're going to start to put fruit before the first winter. So these are the varieties that are going to be the exception. They're going to put fruit the first year, and they're going to put fruit the second year. Floricane raspberries, most of them are floricane. Those are the ones that after they survive the first winter, they start putting fruits in the second year. They don't put fruits in the first year. Black raspberries, purple raspberries, and you have the blackberries. You have two main groups of varieties of blackberries. These are the cultivars. You can look at them when you have time in your handouts. These are the cultivars for blackberries. You can look at them in your handout. More cultivars. It's just important for you to have this information. And just keep in mind that depending on the bramble that you get, you have a harvest period for each one of them. And you can look at these earlier, and you can think about labor consideration when you're thinking about what variety you're gonna grow. I noticed that I had 10 minutes left, so I'm just gonna go quickly through this because I want to get through the questions and I want to give you the survey link. Patrick I think Katie is going to talk about brambles. She's going to do an excellent job talking about this. And this is what I mentioned earlier, that consider just putting a trellis system for your brambles because some of them might not be able to support their own weight. Blueberries, you want to have planting material that's at least 2 years old. You space them 10 to 12 feet between rows and 4 feet between plants. These are the different cultivars that are out there. Probably there's more nowadays. There's more because breeders get happy and they get excited about this, and they come up with these wonderful cultivars every year. So now, like I mentioned earlier, blackberries like acidic soils. They like well-drained soils, and they like soils with high organic matter. Now, the problem is in Missouri is that most of the soils have a high pH. They have low organic matter. They have high calcium content. And I live in Southeast Missouri, and there's a lot of rice being grown here, and that's because the soil has a lot of clay. So there's poor drainage. So if you're interested in growing blackberries, make sure that you do your research really well in terms of soil management, and just get an idea how much it's going to cost how much it's going to take to adjust this soil so that it's suitable for blackberries. Think about the investment. Grapes, like I mentioned, you have two kinds of grapes, wine grapes and table grapes. Usually you want to get a year-old rooted cuttings that the stem has 3/8 of an inch in diameter, or pencil, like a pencil. It's a pencil, like a pencil in terms of thickness in the stem. you plant when dormant in spring. Now, you only plant them when dormant in the fall if it's a cold hardy variety. You don't plant the other varieties in the fall because that planting process and then the cold temperatures are going to severely affect the plants. Space between rows 10 feet, and between plants 8 feet. Dr. Dean Vollenberg is going to give us a class in grapes. I'm just showing this for demonstration purposes, and you can look at them in your handout at a later time. Terminology, you have suckers that grow from the trunk of the grapevine. You have the cordon, which is going to hold the stems that are going to have the leaves and the fruits, and these are called spurs. And these are the buds. And this is just to get you familiarized with the terms that they use for grapes, so that you are prepared for the class when Dr. Vollenberg talked about it. There are other fruit tree crops. There's persimmon, which I've seen it in the supermarket, and I don't know why I don't get excited about it. I mean, now that I'm talking about this class, I was like, yeah, I should try them. So next time I see them, I'm gonna buy some and I'm gonna try them. I don't know when's the right time to eat them, because I have people that say they have to wait for them to be at the right ripeness. So if you have a tip there, just drop it in the chat. I would appreciate it. Pawpaw, this is a native tree, a native fruit that the Native Americans used to pick in the wild. And there's been a lot of research done by several states in the Midwest. I think Ohio State has the largest research program in pawpaw, and they want to make sure that this becomes like a successful commercial fruit. That's the fruit that's native to the United States, made in the USA. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of interest in that. Figs, I like to eat them. I don't know how to grow them. Sorry about that. I cannot help you with that, but I know that we have other specialists that are more experienced, like Patrick Byers, knows a lot about fruit crops. He's going to talk also about mulberries. That's how it looks. I've never tried them. I've never grown them before. Either elderberries, I haven't done that either. So this is just setting you up for future classes that we're going to have, and try to get you excited about them. We have gooseberries and currants also. Katie is going to talk about nut trees, if you're interested in that. You have black walnuts, pecans, hickory, and other nut trees. Thank you for coming on with for joining us tonight. And Ramon, do we have questions? I think we have 5 minutes for questions.
Yeah, if anybody wants some ask some questions, this is the time to write them down in the chat. We don't have at this moment any questions, so if you're willing to do something, ask anything right now.
All right, so I see one there in the chat is like how and where I get the soil tested. Usually the best time to get it tested is in the fall, and you do it every 2 years. And the reason why we recommended you do it in the fall is because when you get the soil test result, it gives you time to work on that soil and prepare that soil for the next growing season. You can come to our local extension offices, and we can help you with that. We can give you information how to take a soil sample, how to prepare it, and we can give you all that consulting job with the soil. There's a second question there is how does permaculture fit into commercial fruit and nut farm? I'm sorry, I'm not the expert in permaculture. I cannot answer that question. I may have to save that question and ask around with other specialists that are more versed in this topic. Okay. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Ramon, for the assistance. And we'll see you next Monday. And I think next Monday, yeah, it's me. I'm going to talk about crop fertility along with Justin Keay. So stay tuned. Thank you all for joining us. and please share the word. If someone wants to register for the whole session next week, we're recording this session, and don't be afraid of registering late. You're gonna get access to the videos, even if you register later, and you're gonna get access to the handout. So if you're gonna register for the whole thing later on, you can do that, or if you're just interested in one of the classes, you can also do that. Thank you very much. Have a good night. See you next Monday. The reason why we do these surveys is because we want to improve ourselves. So the surveys are set up so that you can have a platform that you can use to express your comments to us. Tell us what we did well and what we didn't do well and how we can improve so that we can give you a better service next time.